The year was 1887, and the dust of the New Mexico Territory settled like a shroud over Isabella Montoya's small hacienda. It clung to the adobe walls, muted the vibrant threads of the serape draped over the porch railing, and tasted of grit and sorrow on her tongue. Each sunrise brought with it a renewed ache of loss, a fresh wave of determination, and the ever-present shadow of encroaching change. Her husband, Mateo, had been gone 6 months, taken by a fever that swept through their valley with the merciless speed of a summer storm. He had left her with the land, 10 square leagues of sun-baked earth, a modest herd of cattle, and a legacy woven into the very soil they had toiled together. This land was more than dirt and grass. It was Mateo's heart, his dream, and now, her solitary stand against a world eager to swallow it, and her, whole. Isabella moved through her days with a quiet, fierce grace. She mended fences with hands that were slender but strong, her dark braids often escaping the scarf tied around her head as she worked under the unforgiving sun. She rode out with the few loyal vaqueros Mateo had employed, her presence a silent testament to her resolve. The local Anglo settlers, mostly newcomers with their own insatiable hunger for land, watched her with a mixture of pity and predatory interest. A widow, a Mexican woman alone, she was, in their eyes, an easy mark, her property ripe for the picking. Offers had come, polite at first, then more insistent, whispered through intermediaries or stated bluntly by ambitious men who saw only acreage, not the soul of a place. She refused them all, her no gracious, a soft but unyielding barrier. Her loneliness was a constant companion, a hollow echo in the rooms Mateo's laughter once filled. The scent of his pipe tobacco, long faded from the curtains, sometimes seemed to drift to her on a phantom breeze, a cruel trick of memory. She missed his easy strength, the comforting weight of his arm around her shoulders as they watched the desert sunset paint the sky in hues of fire and rose. But grief, she had learned, was a demanding master, and survival an even more insistent one. She had no time for prolonged despair. The cattle needed tending, the well needed maintenance, and the wolves, both four-legged and two-legged, needed to be kept at bay. Garrett Prescott was a name that had begun to circulate in the valley with increasing frequency. He was a gringo, they said, a rancher from further east, with money and ambition that stretched as wide as the plains themselves. He had already bought out 2 smaller holdings bordering her own, his Bar P brand appearing on fences where familiar marks had once been. Isabella had heard the talk in the dusty cantina in the nearby settlement of Esperanza when she went for supplies, talk of his shrewdness, his drive, his apparent intention to consolidate a vast cattle empire. She braced herself for his inevitable approach, her heart a tight knot of apprehension and defiance. He arrived on a morning when the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the heat already shimmering above the arid landscape. Isabella was in the corral, working with a young, skittish mare, her voice low and soothing as she attempted to gentle the animal. The sound of approaching hoofbeats, steady and confident, made her straighten. 2 riders. One was clearly the man in charge, tall in the saddle, his hat casting his face in shadow. The other, younger and leaner, hung back slightly. Garrett Prescott dismounted with an economy of motion, his spurs jingling softly. He removed his hat, revealing sandy hair bleached by the sun and eyes the color of a winter sky, cool, assessing. He was not overtly menacing, but there was an undeniable air of authority about him, a sense that he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Isabella Montoya?" "Si," she replied, her gaze steady. She wiped a smudge of dust from her cheek with the back of her hand. "What can I do for you, senor?" "Name's Garrett Prescott." He gestured vaguely towards the land around them. "I own the Bar P, adjoining your property to the north and west." Isabella nodded, her expression unreadable. "I know who you are." "Then you probably know why I'm here," he continued, his eyes sweeping over her small, well-kept ranch yard, lingering for a moment on the patched adobe of the main house. "I'm interested in your land, ma'am. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer." The words, though expected, landed like stones in the quiet morning. Isabella felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the old anger mixed with a weary resignation. "My land is not for sale, Senor Prescott." He didn't seem surprised, nor did his expression change. "Everything's for sale, ma'am, for the right price. This is hard country for a woman alone. Managing a spread this size, it takes considerable effort. My offer would allow you a comfortable life elsewhere, perhaps back in Mexico, or a town with more amenities. His assumption that she would want to leave, that her life here was merely a burden to be shed, pricked at her pride. This is my home, Señor. Mateo, my husband, he built this place with his own hands. Its value to me cannot be measured in dollars. Prescott's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. I understand sentimental attachment, ma'am. Truly, I do. But sentiment doesn't pay the bills or keep the wolves from the door. I'm offering $5,000. Cash. It was a significant sum, more than the land was probably worth by purely market standards. Enough to tempt anyone, especially a grieving widow. But Isabella saw past the money to the void it would leave, a void far greater than the one Mateo's death had already carved. My answer remains the same, she said, her voice quiet but firm. This land is not for sale, not for 5,000, not for 10. She turned back to the mare, a clear dismissal. Prescott watched her for a moment, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in his cool eyes. He put his hat back on. I'm a patient man, Señora Montoya. I'll be in Esperanza for a few weeks. Think about my offer, it's a generous one. He mounted his horse, his companion following suit. Good day, ma'am. Isabella did not watch them leave. She focused on the mare, her touch gentle but firm, her heart thudding a rhythm of defiance against her ribs. The Gringo rancher wanted her land. She would not let him have it. The days that followed were filled with a heightened tension. Isabella felt Prescott's presence like a weight on the horizon, even when he wasn't physically there. She knew he was making inquiries, assessing her resources, perhaps waiting for her to crack under the strain. Other, less scrupulous men, emboldened perhaps by Prescott's open interest, began to make their own veiled threats or unwelcome visits. One night, a section of her northern fence was cut, her cattle scattered. It took her and her vaqueros 2 hard days to round them up, the incident leaving her shaken but more resolute. She suspected Prescott, or men working for him, but had no proof. Garrett Prescott, for his part, found himself in an unaccustomed position. He was used to negotiations that were straightforward, if sometimes tough. Money usually talked, and if it didn't, a little well-applied pressure often did the trick. But Isabella Montoya was different. Her quiet refusal was not a bargaining tactic, it was a statement of profound conviction. He'd seen her after their first encounter, riding her land with a proprietary grace, her small figure dwarfed by the immensity of the landscape, yet somehow commanding it. There was a strength in her, a resilience that intrigued him despite his frustration. He had his own reasons for wanting her land. It possessed the only reliable year-round water source in that particular section of the valley, the Rio Somnoliento, the sleepy river, which carved a green ribbon through the otherwise parched terrain. Controlling that water meant controlling the grazing for miles around. It was a strategic imperative for his expanding ranch. He told himself it was just business. But the image of the widow, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of sorrow and spirit, kept intruding on his thoughts. He found himself comparing her quiet dignity to the grasping, often crude ambition of the men he usually dealt with. A week later, a late spring storm, violent and sudden, swept down from the mountains. It came with little warning, the sky turning a bruised purple-black before unleashing a torrent of rain and hail. Isabella was caught out checking a distant line cabin. The wind howled like a grieving banshee, driving the rain in horizontal sheets that stung her face and soaked her to the bone. Her horse, usually steady, became frantic. Visibility dropped to near zero. She knew she had to find shelter, and quickly. The arroyos would be flash flooding, turning dry washes into raging torrents. She remembered an old abandoned line shack on what was now Prescott's land, not far from her own boundary. It wasn't much, but it was closer than her own hacienda. Gritting her teeth against the wind, she urged her horse towards it, praying it was still standing. The shack was dilapidated, but the roof, miraculously, was mostly intact. She managed to get her horse into a rickety lean-to beside it, and then stumbled inside the single small room, shivering violently. The air was cold and damp, smelling of mildew and old earth. She was trying to coax a flame from a few damp twigs she'd found when the door creaked open, and Garrett Prescott stood framed in the opening, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his face grim. For a moment, they just stared at each other, surprise warring with suspicion on both their faces. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rough over the roar of the storm. "Seeking shelter, senor," Isabella retorted, her teeth chattering. "As, I presume, are you?" He stepped inside, shaking off some of the water. The small space immediately felt more crowded. "This is my property." "I am aware," she said, huddling deeper into her wet poncho. But the storm did not ask for permission to cross boundaries. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, her drenched clothes, her pale face, the way she trembled despite her efforts to control it. The businessman's calculation in his eyes flickered, replaced by something more human. He carried a small, waterproofed canvas roll. From it, he produced a dry blanket and a small flask. "Here," he said, holding out the blanket. "You're soaked through." Isabella hesitated. Taking anything from him felt like a concession, a weakening of her defenses. But the cold was seeping into her bones, a deep, numbing chill. Reluctantly, she took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was warm, calloused. "Gracias," she murmured, wrapping the coarse wool around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of him, leather, tobacco, and the clean scent of the outdoors. He offered the flask. "Brandy, it'll help." She took a small sip. The fiery liquid burned its way down her throat, spreading a welcome warmth through her chest. He took a swallow himself, then set about trying to get a fire started with more expertise than she had managed. Soon, a small, sputtering flame caught, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The storm raged outside, a symphony of wind and thunder. Inside the tiny shack, an uneasy truce settled between them. The shared predicament, the forced proximity, began to erode the sharp edges of their animosity. They spoke little at first, the roar of the elements filling the silences. "Your fence was cut last week," Isabella said finally, her voice low. "My cattle scattered." Prescott looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I heard." "It wasn't my doing, senora. I don't operate that way." She wanted to believe him. There was a directness in his gaze that seemed to preclude deceit, but she had learned to be wary. "Someone wants me gone. Someone who thinks a few acts of vandalism will scare me off." "There are always vultures circling," he admitted, poking at the fire. "This land draws them, but that's not my style." They fell silent again, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. The small fire crackled, a fragile beacon of warmth and light against the tempest. Isabella found herself studying him covertly. Stripped of his rancher's bravado by the shared vulnerability of the storm, he seemed different. Less a predator, more a man. There were lines of weariness around his eyes she hadn't noticed before, a hint of some unspoken burden in the set of his jaw. "Why this land, Senor Prescott?" she asked, the question softer than she intended. "There are other properties, larger ones, perhaps even better ones." He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "The water, the Rio Somnoliento, it's the lifeblood of this valley. And," he paused, then continued, almost reluctantly, "and it reminds me of a place I once knew, a long time ago." The unexpected admission, the hint of a past that wasn't solely about acquisition and profit, surprised her. It was a glimpse beneath the surface, a crack in the armor. "A place you loved?" she ventured. He nodded curtly, not elaborating, but the air between them had subtly shifted. The raw antagonism had lessened, replaced by a tentative curiosity. The storm began to subside as dawn approached. The rain softened to a drizzle, the wind died down to a whisper. Exhausted, Isabella had dozed off, huddled in the blanket, her head resting against the rough wall. She woke to find Prescott watching her, his expression thoughtful. The fire had burned down to embers, and a pale, watery light filtered through the single small window. He stood up, stretching stiffly. "Storm's past. I should check on my herds." Isabella also rose, feeling a little awkward now that the immediate crisis was over. "I must return as well. My men will be worried." Outside, the world was washed clean, the air fresh and cool. The ground was muddy, and the arroyos still ran high, but the fury of the storm was spent. "Senora Montoya," Prescott said as she prepared to mount her horse. "About your land, my offer still stands. But I want you to know, I won't resort to underhanded tactics to get it. If you continue to refuse, I'll respect that." His words hung in the air. It was more than she had expected. "Why the change, Señor?" He looked out over the valley, now emerging in the soft morning light, its greens deepened by the rain. "Let's just say, I'm beginning to understand its value beyond dollars and cents." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw not the calculating rancher, but something warmer, something almost like admiration. "You're a strong woman, Isabella Montoya." Mateo was a lucky man. The unexpected use of her first name, the quiet compliment, caught her off guard. A faint blush rose to her cheeks. "He was a good man," she said softly. They parted ways then, riding off in different directions. But something had changed between them during those hours in the storm-battered shack. The wall of mistrust had not crumbled entirely, but a small breach had been made. Garrett Prescott still wanted her land, she knew. But Isabella sensed, with a flicker of an emotion she couldn't quite name, that he was beginning to see her, the woman, as well. In the weeks that followed, an uneasy peace settled over the valley, at least between the Bar P and the Montoya holdings. Prescott made no further attempts to pressure Isabella, though his presence was still a constant factor in the region. He was busy consolidating his other acquisitions, building his empire. Yet, Isabella found herself thinking about their encounter in the shack more often than she cared to admit. His unexpected decency, the fleeting glimpse of vulnerability, had unsettled her preconceived notions of the Gringo rancher. The real threat, however, had not disappeared. If anything, Prescott's apparent backing off seemed to embolden others. A man named Hiram Wade, a known land speculator with a reputation for ruthlessness, began to make his presence felt. Wade was a different breed from Prescott, overtly aggressive, with shifty eyes and a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his face. His offers for Isabella's land were laced with thinly veiled threats. Small acts of sabotage continued, a water trough poisoned, tools disappearing from her shed. Fear, cold and insidious, began to creep into Isabella's heart, a fear not just for her land, but for her own safety. Her vaqueros were loyal, but they were few. One evening, as dusk was settling, Isabella was riding back towards the hacienda after checking on a sick calf. She took a shortcut through a dense thicket of mesquite near the river. Suddenly, two men on horseback burst from the trees, blocking her path. Their faces were obscured by bandanas. "Well, well, what have we here?" one of them sneered, his voice rough. "The little widow all alone." Isabella's heart leaped into her throat. She instinctively reached for the rifle she always carried in its scabbard, but before she could draw it, the other man lunged, grabbing her reins. Her horse reared, and she fought to stay seated. "We have a message for you from Mr. Wade," the first man said, advancing. "He thinks it's time you reconsidered his generous offer. Maybe a little persuasion is in order." Panic seized her, cold and sharp. These men were not just trying to scare her, there was a real menace in their eyes. She knew she was in serious trouble. Just as the man reached for her, a shot rang out, sharp and clear in the twilight air. The man yelped, clutching his arm where the bullet had apparently grazed him. Both assailants whirled around, surprised. Garrett Prescott emerged from the mesquite on his powerful buckskin, a smoking Colt still in his hand. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Get away from her," he commanded, his voice like flint. "Now." The two men, clearly not expecting interference, hesitated for a moment, then, seeing the deadly intent in Prescott's eyes, wheeled their horses and galloped away, disappearing into the growing darkness. Isabella was trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Prescott dismounted and was at her side in an instant, his expression concerned. "Are you all right, Isabella?" he asked, his voice softer now. He used her first name again, and it felt strangely natural. She nodded, unable to speak, her gaze fixed on the spot where the men had vanished. The reality of her danger, the stark realization of how vulnerable she was, hit her with full force. "Wade's men?" he surmised, his jaw tight. She nodded again. They said he sent them." Prescott's eyes narrowed. "I've had my suspicions about Wade. He's a snake. This proves it." He gently took her horse's reins. "Come on. I'll see you back to your hacienda." The ride back was mostly silent. Isabella was still shaken, and Garrett seemed lost in thought, his anger a palpable aura around him. When they reached her gate, her vaqueros, alerted by the distant shot, came running out, their faces anxious. "Patrona," Are you hurt? Old Raphael, her most trusted hand, cried out. I am safe, Raphael, thanks to Senor Prescott, Isabella said, her voice still a little unsteady. Prescott dismounted. She was accosted by two men, likely working for Hiram Wade. He looked at Isabella. You can't stay here alone, not while Wade is making threats. It's not safe. The thought of abandoning her home, even temporarily, was abhorrent to her. This is my home, Garrett. I will not be driven out. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and concern. I understand your pride, Isabella, but pride won't stop a bullet. Wade is capable of anything. An idea, audacious and unexpected, began to form in his mind. It was a risk, a huge one, both personally and for his reputation. But looking at Isabella, her face pale but resolute in the lantern light from the porch, he knew he couldn't just stand by and let Wade harm her or take what was hers through brute force. His desire for her land had long since been overshadowed by a growing, unwilling admiration, an attraction that went deeper than he cared to admit. Now, a fierce protectiveness surged through him. There might be another way, he said slowly, his gaze intense, a way to protect you and your land. Isabella looked at him, puzzled. What do you mean? He took a deep breath. Marry me, Isabella. The proposal, if it could even be called that under such circumstances, hung in the stunned silence. Isabella stared at him, speechless. Raphael and the other vaqueros exchanged bewildered glances. Marry you? She finally whispered, her mind reeling. Senor Prescott. Garrett, are you serious? Perfectly serious, he replied, his expression earnest. Think about it. As my wife, you'd be under my protection. Wade wouldn't dare touch you or your land. He knows he can't go up against the Bar P. It would be a marriage in name, a practical arrangement to ensure your safety. Your land would remain yours. I give you my word on that. Isabella's thoughts were a whirlwind. Marriage, to this Gringo rancher who had, until recently, been her adversary. It was preposterous, and yet, she couldn't deny the logic in his words. She was vulnerable. Wade was dangerous. And Garrett Prescott, for all his initial ruthlessness in business, had shown her a different side, a man capable of fairness, even kindness. He had saved her tonight. She looked into his eyes, searching for guile, for some hidden agenda. She saw only a steady resolve, and something else, a flicker of warmth, of genuine concern that made her heart beat a little faster. Why would you do this? She asked, her voice barely audible. What do you gain? He held her gaze. Perhaps I gain a neighbor I can trust. Perhaps I gain some peace of mind knowing a decent woman isn't being terrorized. And perhaps, he added, his voice dropping lower, I've come to admire your spirit more than I value a few extra acres of grazing land. His honesty disarmed her. The man who had once seen her only as an obstacle, her land only as a commodity, was now offering her his name, his protection, with no apparent strings attached beyond the arrangement itself. It was a staggering turn of events. She thought of Mateo, of her promise to protect their home. This was an unconventional way to do it, a drastic one, but perhaps it was the only way. I need time to think, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Take all the time you need, Garrett said gently. But don't take too long, Wade won't wait forever. He touched the brim of his hat. I'll have my men keep an eye on your property tonight. You'll be safe. He mounted his horse and rode off into the darkness, leaving Isabella standing on her porch, her world turned upside down. The Gringo rancher who had wanted her land, now wanted her, if only as a wife in name, to protect her from a common enemy. The irony was not lost on her. But beneath the shock and confusion, a tiny, unexpected seed of something else began to sprout, a reluctant trust, a hesitant hope. Isabella spent a restless night, her mind replaying Garrett's words, his expression, the unexpected intensity in his eyes. Marriage. The word itself felt alien when associated with any man other than Mateo. Yet, the stark reality of her situation could not be ignored. Hiram Wade was a genuine threat, and she was, despite her fierce independence, alone. Garrett's proposal, however unconventional, offered a shield. It was a business arrangement, he had said, a marriage of convenience. But his final words, about admiring her spirit, echoed in her thoughts, stirring a warmth that had little to do with business. The next morning, she sent Raphael with a message to the Bar P. Garrett arrived within the hour, his face serious, expectant. He found Isabella in her small, neatly kept parlor. Sunlight streamed through the lace-curtained window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She looked tired, but her resolve was firm. "I have considered your proposal, Signor Prescott," she began, her voice formal. "Garrett?" he corrected gently. A faint color rose in her cheeks. "Garrett, I accept. Under the conditions you stated, this will be an arrangement to protect my land and my person. My property remains mine." A barely perceptible wave of relief washed over his features. "That is understood, Isabella. Your land, your heritage, will always be respected. I give you my word as a Prescott." He paused. "And though this begins as an arrangement, I hope, in time, we can be friends." Friends. It was a modest hope, yet it resonated with her. She had been so long without true companionship beyond her loyal vaqueros. Perhaps, she conceded, a small, hesitant smile touching her lips. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in Esperanza before a stern-faced justice of the peace. Few attended: Raphael, a couple of Garrett's most trusted ranch hands, and the justice's wife as a witness. Isabella wore a simple dark dress, her mother's antique lace mantilla her only adornment. Garrett, in a new suit, looked uncharacteristically solemn. As they exchanged vows, words that felt both momentous and surreal, Isabella glanced at him. His blue eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not the calculating rancher, but a man making a solemn commitment, a man whose gaze held a surprising tenderness. News of their marriage spread through the valley like wildfire. Speculation was rife. Some whispered that Prescott had finally found a way to get his hands on the Montoya land. Others, more charitable or perhaps more romantic, wondered if an unlikely love had blossomed. Hiram Wade was reportedly furious, his plans thwarted. He made a few blustering threats, but with Isabella now under the formidable protection of the Bar P ranch and its owner, his aggression subsided into sullen resentment. He knew Garrett Prescott was not a man to be trifled with. Life changed for Isabella. She did not move to Garrett's larger, more imposing ranch house immediately. Instead, Garrett often found reasons to be at the Montoya hacienda, discussing cattle, water rights, or repairs needed on her property. He treated her with a deferential respect that slowly chipped away at her remaining defenses. He never pressed her, never presumed upon their new relationship. He listened to her opinions about ranching, often deferring to her deeper knowledge of this specific land and its peculiarities. He spoke of his own past, of the family he had lost, revealing a loneliness that mirrored her own. They shared meals on her porch, the desert evenings cool and fragrant with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. The silences between them were no longer strained but filled with a comfortable awareness of each other's presence. Isabella found herself looking forward to his visits, to the sound of his voice, the steadiness of his gaze. He, in turn, found himself captivated by her quiet strength, her resilience, the gentle humor that occasionally broke through her reserved exterior. The land, once the sole object of his desire, had become the backdrop to a far more compelling interest, the woman who was now his wife. He had wanted her land, yes, but now, he realized with a startling clarity that shook him to his core, he wanted Isabella, not her property, not her name for protection, but her. Her heart, her trust, her companionship. One evening, months after their wedding, they were riding together along the Rio Somnoliento, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery strokes. They had spent the afternoon checking a section of fence that had been damaged by a small rock slide. "The land looks good this year," Garrett remarked, his gaze sweeping over the valley. "The rains were kind." "Si," Isabella agreed. "Mateo always said this land gives back what you put into it." She paused, then, emboldened by the growing ease between them, she asked, "Do you ever regret this, Garrett? This arrangement?" He reined in his horse, turning to face her. The fading light softened the rugged lines of his face, and his eyes, usually so cool and assessing, were warm. "Regret it?" He shook his head slowly. "No, Isabella, I don't regret it." He hesitated, then continued, his voice deeper, more earnest than she had ever heard it. "When I first came to this valley, I saw only land to be acquired, resources to be controlled. I saw you as an obstacle." He reached out, his gloved hand covering hers where it rested on the saddle horn. Her breath hitched. "I was a fool," he said softly. "A blind fool. This land is beautiful, yes, but it's you, Isabella. You are what makes this valley truly special. Your strength, your spirit, your heart. I wanted your land, it's true, but somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, I started wanting you instead. Not as part of a bargain, not for convenience, just you." Isabella's heart swelled, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost overwhelmed her. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of his earnest face. His confession, so unexpected, so heartfelt, resonated with the feelings that had been slowly, secretly growing within her own heart. Feelings of respect, admiration, and a burgeoning affection that felt dangerously like love. "Garrett," she whispered, her voice choked. He dismounted, then gently helped her down from her horse. Standing before her, he took both her hands in his. "This started as an arrangement, Isabella," he said, his gaze searching hers. "But it doesn't have to stay that way, not for me. I know I don't deserve it, after how I first approached you, but I find myself caring for you more than I thought possible." The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, stripped away her last vestiges of doubt. This was not the Gringo rancher speaking, nor the calculating businessman. This was Garrett, the man who had sheltered her from a storm, protected her from harm, and slowly, unexpectedly, captured her heart. She raised a trembling hand to his cheek. "Oh, Garrett," she said, her voice soft but clear. I think I have come to care for you too." A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that transformed him, chasing away the shadows and revealing the depth of his relief and joy. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was tentative at first, then deepened, sealing a new beginning under the vast, starlit canvas of the New Mexico sky. It was a kiss that spoke of past sorrows acknowledged, of prejudices overcome, and of an unexpected love found in the most unlikely of circumstances. The land around them, once a source of conflict, now seemed to embrace them, a silent witness to their hard-won peace. The Gringo rancher had indeed wanted her land, but in seeking it, he had found something far more precious. The Mexican widow who had, against all odds, made him want her instead, and in doing so, had found her own heart healed and her future unexpectedly bright. Their journey had been one of resilience, of unexpected kindness, and of a love that defied all expectations, a love as strong and enduring as the ancient land itself.